I smelled the smoke before I saw the town. That is the first thing I want you to understand, because it tells you everything about the kind of luck I have always carried. A man rides 3 weeks across the Gila country, eating dust and jerky and his own bad thoughts, dreaming of nothing more ambitious than a roof and a plate of something hot. And what greets him at the end of it is the smell of a barn that has finished burning, and the particular hush a place gets when it has done something it is ashamed of. My horse knew it too. Dewey, I called him, after a mule I'd lost in '74 who had more sense than most men I've ridden with. Dewey put his ears back and slowed without my asking, the way an animal does when it can feel that the ground ahead is wrong. I let him slow. I have learned to trust a horse's nerves over my own appetite. It was late afternoon. The light in that part of Arizona territory comes down sideways in the last hours, gold and thick as syrup, and it made the whole town of Cabezon look almost gentle. A scatter of adobe and clapboard, a church with no bell, a well, a store, a saloon that called itself the Silver Spur, though I never once saw a piece of silver pass through its doors that anybody had come by honestly. And in the middle of the only street worth the name, maybe 40 people stood in a ring. I knew the shape of a crowd like that the way you know the shape of a coffin. You do not have to be told. I pulled my hat down and told myself, Tom, you old fool, ride around. I have a habit of giving myself advice in my own father's voice, which is strange, since my father gave me very little advice in life, and most of it was wrong. But the habit comforts me. Ride around, I told myself. You are a hired man with $11 and a sore back and no stake in this town's grief. I did not ride around. She was on her knees in the dirt at the center of the ring. I want to be careful telling you about her, because in the years since, I have heard so many men describe her in ways that were not true, made her into a witch or a saint or a story, when she was neither, when she was a person, which is harder to carry than either. So let me just tell you what I saw, plainly, the way I'd write it in my tally book, which I keep in my vest pocket and fill with the small accountings of my days. Weather, miles, the price of oats, the names of men who owe me. She was Apache. Chiricahua I'd learn later, though that afternoon she was only the squaw to the men who had her, which is a word I will not use again in this telling because it was used enough that day to last me the rest of my life. She was perhaps 30. Hard to say. The desert ages a face the way it ages everything, fast and then not at all. Her hair was black, unbraided now, hanging loose because someone had torn the wrappings out of it, and there was a cut above her eye that had bled and dried and bled again. Her wrists were tied behind her back. That was the thing I could not stop looking at, the rope. They had used a good length of new hemp and they had pulled it cruel tight, the kind of tight a man only ties when he has stopped thinking of the thing he's binding as a person who can feel. Her hands had gone a color hands should not go, and she was not struggling against it. That was what undid me, sitting up there on Dewey at the edge of the crowd. She was not struggling. She knelt straight-backed in the dust with her chin level, looking at the men around her one at a time, slow, deliberate, the way you might count a herd you intend to remember. Like she was memorizing their faces. Like she had already decided how this ended, and the only thing left to do was witness it carefully. You lost, mister. The man who said it had stepped out from the crowd to plant himself in the road in front of Dewey. Big through the shoulders, going soft through the middle, with a tin star pinned crooked on a vest that had seen better men. The kind of badge a town hands out not to its bravest but to its loudest. He had a face like a fist and small, wet eyes, and he was sweating in a way that wasn't only the heat. Just passing, I said. Then pass. I should have. God help me. Every sensible bone I own told me to touch my hat and ride on and find a meal somewhere that didn't smell like burnt barn and bad conscience. I have ridden away from worse. I rode away from a man being whipped in Tucson once, and I have lived with that for 19 years, and it has cost me more sleep than any fight I ever lost. But Dewey wouldn't move when I touched my heel to him. He just stood there, ears flat, blowing. And in the half-second of that small stubbornness, I made the mistake of looking past the sheriff's shoulder, and the woman in the dirt turned her head and looked back at me. I have tried many times to describe that look, and I always fail. It was not pleading. That is the thing people expect, and it is the thing that wasn't there. There was no help me in it. If anything, there was a kind of cold appraisal, the same look she'd been giving the men around her. What kind are you? And then when I didn't immediately spit or sneer or look away, something in it shifted. Not hope, smaller than hope. Curiosity, maybe. The faint surprise of a person who has been treated like an object for so long that being looked at like a person registers as an event. "What'd she do?" I heard myself say. The sheriff's wet eyes narrowed. "Killed a man. Burned the Prout barn with him inside it. Boy not yet 20. His voice rose so the crowd could hear him being righteous. "Caleb Prout. Found him this morning, what's left of him, and her not a mile off with his horse and blood on her hands." A murmur went through the ring, that low, ugly hum a crowd makes when it agrees with itself. I looked at her hands again, at the rope, at the dried dark on her knuckles that could have been Caleb Prout's blood or could have been her own, since her wrists were torn raw from the binding, and a face cut like she had over the eye bleeds onto everything. "She confess?" I asked. "Don't speak English," somebody called from the crowd, and laughed, as if that settled it. As if a person who can't argue in your language has forfeited the right to argue at all. And here is the moment I keep coming back to. The moment I'd write in my tally book if I had words small enough to fit it. The woman heard the laugh, and she looked at the man who'd laughed, and then, slow, deliberate, with her ruined hands tied behind her and 40 people deciding she would hang, she smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not a frightened one. It was the smile of somebody who has just learned the exact size and shape of the people who are going to kill her and finds them smaller than she feared. I have seen brave men in my life. I rode with some in the war and I buried most of them. But I had never, until that afternoon in Cabzon, seen anything like the courage it took for that woman to smile at the men who hated her, knowing it would only make them hate her more, and doing it anyway because she would be damned before she'd give them her fear. Something in my chest went over like a wagon on a grade. "I'd like to hear her side," I said. The whole street went quiet. You could hear the well rope creaking in the breeze and a dog somewhere, and the small ticking sounds a burned building makes for hours after, settling into its own ash. The sheriff stared at me. "She don't have a side. She's got blood on her hands and a dead boy, and you got a horse pointed the wrong way down my street." "I heard you. I'm asking, does anyone here speak her tongue or any Apache near enough so we can ask her what happened? That's all. Seems a small thing to ask before you stretch a person's neck." "It ain't your business, Drifter." "No," I agreed, "it ain't," and I swung down off Dewey anyway. "I want to be honest with you, because this story is no good if I let myself be braver in the telling than I was in the living. My hands were not steady when I dismounted. I was a 51-year-old cowhand with a bad knee and an empty stomach, alone in a town that wanted blood, and every instinct I owned was screaming. I have never been a brave man. I have been, on a few occasions, a man too stubborn to do the cowardly thing, and I have noticed those two get confused for one another by people watching from a safe distance. I led Dewey to the rail and tied him slow, giving myself time, giving the crowd time, because a crowd that has worked itself up to do something is at its most dangerous in the first minute, and a man can sometimes ride out that minute just by moving calm. There was a woman in the ring, a real townswoman, gray-haired, with flour still on her apron like she'd been pulled straight from her kitchen to come watch a hanging. And I picked her because she had her arms crossed and a frown that wasn't aimed at the prisoner. It was aimed at the men. "Ma'am," I said, "anybody in this town speak Apache?" She didn't answer right off. Then lo, old Esperanza out at the wash, half Mexican, half mescalero, she traded with them back before the army moved everybody to San Carlos. A pause. "Sheriff won't send for her." "Why not?" The flour-dusted woman looked at me with the flat, tired eyes of someone who has watched her town do shameful things before and expects to again. Because she'd come, she said, and then we'd have to listen. I will tell you what I learned about Caleb Prout that evening, because it matters, and because the town of Cabzon took great care not to learn it themselves. Caleb Prout was 19 and the youngest of 3 Prout boys, and the Prouts ran cattle on the best water for 40 miles, which is another way of saying they ran the town. The older 2 boys were known to be hard. The youngest was known to be worse, the kind of cruel that comes from never once in his life being told no. There were girls in Cabzon who crossed the street when they saw him. There was a Mexican family who had packed up and left after the middle Prout boy did something to their daughter that nobody would name out loud. This was a town that had learned, the way frightened towns do, that the safest thing to do about the Prouts was to look the other way and thank God it was somebody else's daughter. I learned this not from the sheriff but from the bartender at the Silver Spur, an hour later after I had failed. I want to be clear that I had failed completely in the street, to get a single one of them to send for old Esperanza. The sheriff had told me to mind my business or share the woman's tree. The crowd had made the noises crowds make, and I had been, in that moment, a coward after all because I had backed off. I had tied my horse and I had asked my questions, and when the answer was a fist cocked back and 40 people behind it, I had stepped away. I want you to sit with that because I have had to. I did not save her in the street. I asked some questions and lost my nerve and walked into a saloon to think, while a woman knelt in the dirt with rope eating into her wrists. That is the truth of the first day. Courage is not one grand moment. It is 100 small chances to step forward, most of which you fumble. The bartender was a thin, nervous man named Ferris who polished the same glass the whole time he talked to me, around and around, like the polishing was the only thing keeping his hands from shaking. And it was Ferris, not the sheriff, not the crowd, who told me the thing that turned my stomach to stone. "That Prout barn," he said low, eyes on the door. "It didn't just catch. Caleb kept a girl out there, Apache girl. Young, bought her or stole her, off some no-account who'd taken her in a raid down south. There's men who deal in that, mister. There's men who'll sell a person same as a horse and worse." The glass went around and around. "He kept her in that barn near a year. The woman they got tied up out there now," he jerked his chin toward the street, "she come into town 3 days ago. Asking after a girl, her daughter I think, or her sister, somebody hers." The glass stopped. "That barn burned with Caleb in it," Ferris said. "But nobody's asking where the girl is. The one he kept. Nobody's asking because if she's alive, then there's a witness to what Caleb Prout was. And the Prouts would rather hang a stranger than let this town remember it ever turned its head." I set down my drink. I had not touched it. "Where's the girl now?" I asked. Ferris looked at me with something that was almost pity. "Mister," he said, "that's the question that gets folks killed in this town." I went back out into the street as the light was going. They had moved her. While I'd been failing to be brave in a saloon, they had hauled the woman to the big cottonwood at the edge of town, the one tree for miles tall enough for the purpose, and they had her sitting against its trunk now with the rope run around it, so that her bound arms were pulled back hard against the bark, and her shoulders must have been screaming. A few men stood guard, passing a bottle. The crowd had thinned the way crowds do at supper time. Even a hanging waits on a man's belly, but I knew they'd be back at dawn, fuller, braver, ready. I walked to the tree slow, hands where the guards could see them. "Sheriff know you're here," one of them said. "Sheriff knows everything," I said, which was a thing that meant nothing and brought me 3 steps closer. I crouched down in front of her, an arm's length back, out of kicking range, though she didn't look like she had a kick left in her. The cut over her eye had stopped bleeding. Her lips were cracked. Nobody had given her water. She watched me come, and her eyes were the only part of her with any strength left in them, and they were full of it, brimming, more strength than I had in my whole body. I didn't speak Apache. She didn't speak English. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I took off my hat. I held it in both hands the way you do at a grave. And I looked at her, not at the rope, not at the blood, at her. And I said, low and slow, knowing she couldn't understand a word but hoping the tone would carry where the words couldn't. I don't know what you did. I don't think it's what they say. I think there's a girl out there somewhere that you came a long way to find, and I think that boy had it coming if half of what I heard is true, and I think these men are going to kill you in the morning to keep a secret. My voice cracked and I let it. I don't know how to stop them. I'm one man and I'm not a brave one and I've got no law and no kin and no gun fast enough. But I'm not going to ride out of this town. I want you to know that. Whatever happens tomorrow, there was one man here who knew you were a person. She watched my mouth move. When I finished, she was quiet a long moment. Then she said, in English cracked and accented and slow, but clear, clear as the well-water nobody had given her. The girl is alive. I felt the ground tilt. You speak, I started. She said. Her eyes held mine, fierce, urgent, a person spending the last of her strength on the only thing that mattered. Let them think I don't. They say things in front of me, I listen. A breath. My daughter is alive, I hid her before the fire. She is in the rocks north by the dead juniper. 3 days with no food. If I die and hear her voice did not break, hear her voice got harder, the steel under the skin, if I die in the morning no one looks for her. She waits for me. She waits and I do not come, and she does not know to run. She will die in the rocks waiting for a mother who is hanging from a tree. The guards laughed at something among themselves, oblivious, passing the bottle. The woman leaned as far toward me as the rope would let her, which was almost nothing, an inch, but in that inch was everything. I don't ask you to save me, she said. Listen to me, white man, I am already dead. I made my peace at the fire, but the girl is not dead. The girl is 12 years and she has been used by that animal for a year and she is hiding in the rocks because I told her to and she trusts me and I cannot keep my word. Her eyes were dry. That was the worst of it. They were perfectly dry. Forget me, find her. Take her south to the people at the river crossing, the Mexican families. They will know her kind. Tell her, and now, only now, the smallest catch, tell her that her mother came, that her mother found her, that her mother was not afraid. I knelt there in the dirt with my hat in my hands, and I understood that I had ridden into the worst kind of story there is. Not the kind with a villain to shoot and a maiden to save and a sunset to ride into. The other kind. The true kind. The kind where the bravest person within 50 miles was a tied-up woman who had already given herself up for dead, and the only thing she wanted from the world before she left, it was for a stranger to keep a promise to a child in the rocks. What's your name? I asked her. It seemed suddenly the most important thing I had ever asked anyone. She looked at me a long moment, weighing whether a name was worth spending. Nish, she said. It means she searched for it, the one who goes ahead, to see if it is safe. Something flickered in her, almost a smile. My mother was hopeful. Tom, I said, Tom Ashby. It doesn't mean anything, my mother wasn't. And Nish, tied to a tree, bleeding, a day from death, with everything in the world taken from her, but the one fact she was guarding with the last of her life. Nish laughed. It was the smallest sound. It cost her. But she laughed there in the dark at my poor joke, the way one person laughs with another. And I knew then, kneeling in that dirt, that I was not going to be able to do the sensible thing. I was not going to be able to ride away. The dog was still barking somewhere. The barn was still ticking as it cooled. And out in the rocks to the north, by a dead juniper, a 12-year-old girl was sitting very still in the dark, doing exactly as her mother had told her, waiting. I put my hat back on. Naquotish, I said, I'm going to do something stupid. A man learns a great deal about himself in the hours between deciding to do something stupid and actually doing it. I learned that night in Cabzoq10 that I am a coward who keeps going anyway. I had hoped, somewhere in the back of my chest, to discover I was secretly brave, That under the gray and the bad knee there was a younger, harder man who'd been waiting all these years for one good reason. There wasn't. There was just me, 51 and afraid, walking dewy out the north end of town in the dark with my heart going like a trapped bird, doing the thing because I had told a woman I would, and I have a horror of being the kind of man who lies to the dying. I left the town the way you leave a sleeping animal, slow, quiet. I did not saddle up at the rail where the guards could see. I led Dewey out on foot, past the well, past the last adobe, until the buildings fell behind and there was only the dark and the cold coming up off the desert and the enormous, indifferent sky. And Aquotish had given me directions in pieces, the way you give directions to a stranger you are not sure you can trust, which I did not blame her for. North, the dry wash, follow it up, where the wash forks take the left, the narrow one. Past 3 big rocks shaped she'd struggled for the English like sleeping things. Then a dead juniper, white as bone, struck by lightning years back, and in the rocks below the juniper a hollow place, and in the hollow place a girl. She will not come for your voice, Aquotish had told me, urgent, the guard's bottle gurgling somewhere behind us. She will run or she will fight, she has reason to fear men. You must, and here she done a thing I will remember when I have forgotten my own name. She had, with her wrists tied behind a tree and her body failing, hummed a few notes. Lo, a scrap of a melody, 4 notes that rose and fell and rose. Sing this, she knows it, her whole life I sang it. She will know her mother sent you, because no one else in the world knows this song. So I went north in the dark, humming 4 notes to myself like a madman, terrified I'd forget them. Terrified I'd get them wrong. An old cowhand with no ear for music trying to carry a mother's lullaby across a desert to a child who'd been taught by a year of horror that the sound of a man approaching meant pain. I want to tell you about the dark out there, because if you have only known the dark of towns, you do not know the dark at all. The desert at night is not empty. That is the lie people tell who have never sat in it. It is full of small sounds, the skitter of things in the brush, the cough of something hunting, the wind finding the hollows in the rock and making them speak. The cold comes up out of the ground like water filling a boot. The stars are so many and so bright they throw shadows. And a man alone in it, on foot, leading a nervous horse, going toward a thing he is afraid of for the sake of a promise to a stranger. That man has a great deal of time to ask himself what in God's name he is doing. I asked myself the whole way up the wash. I thought about Tucson, 19 years gone, and the man being whipped, and how I'd ridden off and told myself it wasn't my fight. I thought about all the time since that I'd looked the other way, because looking the other way is so much easier, and the world gives you so very many chances to do it. I thought about how a life is mostly made of those small turnings away, how you don't notice them piling up until you're an old man eating dust alone and realizing you have arranged your entire existence around the avoidance of one hard moment. And I thought, maybe this is the moment. Maybe a man only gets the one. Maybe everything before was just practice for finding out at 51 whether you'll turn away this time too. The wash forked. I took the left, the narrow one, my hands raw from leading Dewey over the rocks. 3 boulders, hunched in the starlight, shaped God help me. She was right like sleeping things, like great animals curled against the cold. And past them, pale against the black rock, the dead juniper, white as bone, just as she'd said. I stopped at the foot of it, and my legs were shaking, and not from the cold. "All right, Tom," I said very quietly to myself in my father's voice. "All right." I started to hum. Nothing happened. I hummed the 4 notes. They came out wrong, flat, cracked, an old man's voice with the fear shaking it, and the desert swallowed them and gave me back nothing but the wind. I tried again. Louder, steadier. I sang them this time, no words because I had none, just the rise and fall and rise, into the dark below the dead tree where the rocks made a deeper black. Nothing. A long, terrible nothing. And the thought came to me, cold as the ground. She's dead. 3 days no food, no water, a child in the rocks. You're singing to a corpse, you fool, you came too late, you stopped in the saloon and lost your nerve, and now you're singing a dead song to a dead girl. And then a stone moved. The smallest sound, a pebble displaced, and then low in the rocks 2 eyes catching the starlight, wide, animal-wary, not moving. I did not move either. I sat down, slow. I made myself smaller, an old trick with frightened things. You make yourself low and small and harmless. And I sat down in the cold sand at the foot of the dead juniper, and I kept singing the 4 notes, soft now, soft as I could, the way I imagine her mother sang them, and I let the girl in the rocks decide. It took a long time. I do not know how long. Long enough that my legs went numb under me and the cold got into my bones and the stars wheeled overhead. I just kept singing. 4 notes, around and around, until they stopped being a song and became a kind of prayer, the only prayer I know how to say, which is the same thing over and over until something answers. She came out of the rocks like a thing being born, slow, painful in pieces. First a hand, then a face, smudged and gaunt, the cheeks fallen in from 3 days of nothing. Then the rest of her, unfolding from the hollow place, a girl so thin and so small that I understood, looking at her, exactly what kind of man Caleb Pruitt had been, and exactly why a barn had burned with him in it. And I found I could not summon 1 ounce of grief for him. She stood a few feet off, swaying, watching me, ready to bolt, and she said something in Apache, a question, her voice a cracked whisper. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the question. Where is she? Where is my mother? Why are you the one who came? And here is where I had to make the worst decision of my life. And I made it in about 2 seconds, kneeling in the sand. And I have turned it over 1,000 times since, and I still do not know if I chose right. Because the truth was, her mother was tied to a tree and would hang at dawn, and I could not stop it. The truth was that I had come to take this child south and leave her mother to die, because that is what her mother had begged me to do. The truth was a thing too heavy to hand a starving 12-year-old in the dark. I could lie. I could say her mother was safe, was waiting, was coming. I could get her on the horse with a kind lie and ride her south and let the truth find her later, gentler, somewhere with food in her belly and walls around her. Or I could tell her. I looked at that girl, at her mother's eyes, the same fierce eyes, set in a starved child's face, and I thought about what Naquotish had said. Tell her that her mother came, that her mother found her, that her mother was not afraid, not a lie, the truth but the bearable part of it, a mother who had spent her last strength making sure her daughter would not wait alone in the rocks for a woman who would never come. I did not have her language, so I did the only thing I had. I held out my open hands empty, to show I carried nothing to hurt her with. And I sang the 4 notes again, and then I touched my own chest over my heart, and then I pointed back toward the town, toward the south of it, away from the cottonwood tree, and I shook my head slow, and I let my own face show her what I could not say. I am not ashamed to tell you I wept. An old man, kneeling in the sand, weeping in front of a child, because there was no word in any language we shared for your mother loved you enough to die making sure you wouldn't, and the tears were the only honest thing I had left to give her. The girl understood. Children always understand more than we want them to. I watched it move across her face, the question. The dawning, the refusal, and then, terribly, the acceptance, the same straight-backed acceptance I'd seen in her mother kneeling in the dirt. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She stood there in the starlight and she shook all over like a young tree in a wind, and she made a sound I have never been able to forget and never want to hear again. And then she walked to me, this child who had every reason in the world to never again trust a man, and she put her starved arms around my neck, and she held on. I got water into her first. Sips slow from my canteen. You can kill a starved body with too much too fast. I learned that on a cattle drive in '69 when we found a lost wrangler 4 days dry. Then a little hardtack, soaked soft. She ate like an animal at first and then, catching herself, slowed, took small bites, watching me the whole time over the food. I wrapped her in my bedroll. She was shaking still, fever bright, 3 days of cold and terror catching up with her all at once. I built no fire, a fire would be a beacon, and I did not yet know who from that town might come north. So I held her instead, the way you'd hold a chilled calf, and I hummed the 4 notes until somewhere past the middle of the night her shaking eased, and her breathing went deep and she slept. And I sat there in the cold with a sleeping child in my arms, and I made my second decision of the night. Because here is the thing I had not let myself look at squarely, riding north. Nish had said forget me. She had said I am already dead, find the girl, go south. And the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing she had begged me to do, was exactly that, wait for first light, mount up with the child and ride south, away from the cottonwood, away from the rope, away from the 40 people who would gather at dawn with their bellies full and their consciences quiet, and let the worst happen to a woman I could not save. I looked down at the girl in my arms. I thought she will spend her whole life knowing her mother hanged, and I thought, but at least she will be alive to know it. The math was simple. 1 life I might save, against 1 life I almost certainly could not. Any sensible man rides south. But I am not, it turns out, a sensible man. I am a stubborn one. And somewhere in that cold, long night, holding that child, listening to her breathe, I started doing a different kind of math, a fool's math, a coward's math, the kind that gets people killed, and it went like this. There was a girl, and the only reason that girl was condemned to a life of knowing her mother hanged was that one town wanted to keep a secret. And the secret was the girl. And if the secret stood up, alive, in the middle of that street, in the daylight, in front of 40 people, if the whole town was made to look at the thing it had decided to hang a woman rather than remember, then maybe the secret didn't have to die. Maybe a witness could save the witnessed. It was a terrible idea. It was reckless past the point of madness. It risked the 1 life I had actually managed to save, to maybe, possibly, against all odds, save the one I'd been told to abandon. If it went wrong, both of them died and me with them, and Nish's last wish, take her south, keep her safe, would be betrayed by the very man she'd trusted to keep it. I sat with that, the honest weight of it. A man does not get to feel noble about a gamble like that, because if you lose, you have murdered the thing you meant to save, and no amount of good intention washes the blood off. I looked at the stars. I looked at the girl. I thought about Tucson, 19 years gone, and the man being whipped, and how the easiest truth is the one that lets you sleep. I have not since that night slept easy, but I have slept knowing I did not turn away. Toward the grayest hour before dawn, the girl woke. She woke all at once, the way the hunted do, eyes open and body still, taking stock before she let on she was awake. Then she saw me and remembered, and the grief came back into her face, but under it now something else. Something I recognized because I'd seen it in her mother in the street. That cold appraisal. What kind are you? I did not have her language, but I had been thinking all night about how to ask a child to be brave one more time, and I had decided that some things cross any border if you mean them hard enough. I pointed south, the safe way, and I made my hands into the shape of riding, and I raised my eyebrows. We can go, you and I, away from all of it safe. And she watched me and waited, because she was her mother's daughter and she knew there was a second part. Then I pointed back toward the town. I touched my heart. I sang the 4 notes, her mother's notes, and I pointed to her, to the girl, and then I stood her up gentle in the gray light, and I turned her to face south where safety was, and then slowly turned her to face the town, and I let the question sit in my eyes. Your mother is there. They will hurt her at sunrise. We could run and live, and you would be safe, and she would die. Or we could go back into the lion's mouth and try, only try, no promises to make them look at you and stop. It is the most dangerous thing in the world, and it is not my choice to make. It is yours. She is your mother. You have already lost everything once. I will not gamble what's left of you without your leave. The girl looked south, a long time, At the open desert, the safe direction, the rest of a life. Then she looked at the town. And then this child, this starved, broken, 12-year-old child who had every reason to choose herself, whom no one on this earth would have blamed for choosing herself. This child reached up and took my hand and turned us both to face the town and took a step toward it. Toward the rope, toward the men, toward her mother. I have known soldiers and trail bosses and lawmen and one or two genuinely dangerous outlaws. I have never in my life seen courage like a small girl walking back toward the place that broke her because her mother was still inside it. "All right," I said, and my voice was steady now, finally. All the fear burned out of it and something harder left behind. I lifted her up onto Dewey and swung up behind her and turned us south, at first south, then east, to come into Cape Zon with the rising sun at our backs, so the whole town would have to squint into the light to see the two of us coming. So they would have to look. The sky was going pale in the east. Somewhere ahead, in a town that thought its secret was safe, men were waking up, pulling on their boots, walking toward a cottonwood tree. And riding toward them out of the sunrise came an old coward who'd finally stopped turning away, and a little girl who was about to do the bravest thing I have ever seen a human being do. I touched my heel to Dewey. This time he went. They had already gotten her on her feet by the time we crested the rise. That is the picture I carry and will carry to whatever grave I'm given. The town of Cape Zon gathered under the cottonwood in the raw new light, 40-some of them, more now than the day before, because word travels and a hanging draws a crowd the way carrion draws birds. And in the middle of them, on her feet at last, swaying, was Nige. They'd cut her loose from the tree, only to retie her hands in front, and they'd stood her on the bed of a buckboard wagon pulled up beneath the big limb. And a man was up there with her, fitting a noose over her head, and the rope went up over the branch, and down to a knot held by 3 men who would, on the sheriff's word, walk the horse forward and pull the wagon out from under her. She was not begging. I want that known. To the very last she stood straight as she could on her ruined legs and looked out over the crowd with that same cold, counting gaze, and I understood now what she was doing, because I'd seen the same look on her daughter's face in the rocks. She was making them be people. She was refusing to let them turn her into the easy thing, the witch, the murderess, the not quite human, by being stubbornly, to her last breath, a person looking back at them, making them earn it. Making them know. The sheriff was reading something off a paper. Charges, I suppose. Making it official, the way frightened men make their cruelties official so they can call them justice. And then the girl, sitting in front of me on Dewey, made a sound. It started low. It built. It was the 4 notes her mother's song, but loud now, flung out across the morning at the top of a child's cracked voice, and it cut through the sheriff's droning like a blade through cloth. Every head in that crowd turned. I have thought a great deal about what they saw in that moment, the people of Cape Zon. They saw the sun coming up behind us, so that we were 2 dark shapes against the glare, and they had to lift their hands to their eyes. They saw an old cowhand on a tired horse, and they saw a girl, an Apache girl, thin as a fence rail, the unmistakable look of the half-dead about her, singing a song that, up on that wagon, the condemned woman clearly knew, because Nisha's head had come up. And across 40 yards of stunned mourning, mother and daughter found each other's faces, and the woman who had not begged, who had not wept, who had made her peace at the fire and gone to the rope with a straight back. That woman made a sound I have no word for, a sound that was every prayer and every grief and every fierce, impossible joy a human chest can hold all at once, breaking out of her. The girl tried to scramble down off the horse. I held her gently, an arm across her, because we were not safe yet. We were the opposite of safe. We had ridden into the middle of 40 armed and frightened people, and the next minute would decide everything. I walked Dewey forward, slow, into the crowd, which parted not from respect, from confusion, the way a crowd parts around anything it doesn't understand yet. "That's the girl," somebody said, low, then louder, spreading. That's Caleb's, that's the girl from the barn. And there it was, the secret breathing on the back of my horse in the daylight where they could not unsee it. I stopped Dewey in the cleared space before the wagon and I did not get down. I wanted height. I wanted them looking up. I had thought, riding in, about what I would say, and I had decided against a speech because I am no good at speeches and because a speech would let them argue. Instead, I just lifted the girl down, set her on her own feet in the dirt, and I let her run. She ran to the wagon. She ran to her mother. And there was not a man in that crowd quick enough or cruel enough, in that one suspended moment, to stop a starving child from reaching up toward a woman with a noose around her neck. Naish could not bend down, the rope held her. But the girl pressed her face against her mother's bound hands, and Naish curled those hands around her daughter's head as best the binding allowed, and the two of them stayed like that, and the whole town watched, and the whole town understood all at once exactly what it had been about to do. It did not save her, not by itself. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where the crowd's heart melts and justice rolls in like weather and everyone goes home better, and that version is a lie, and you deserve the true one. What the truth was, the spell held about 10 seconds, and then the oldest Prout brother, I knew him by his face, the same fist face as the sheriff's master, pushed forward and said, loud, ugly, "What does it change? She still killed him. She still burned my brother. Get the girl off the wagon and finish it." And men started to move. And I understood we were going to lose, that the gamble had failed, that I had ridden a saved child back into death to watch them hang her mother in front of her, and that this was the thing I would carry, this exact thing, for whatever was left of my life. That is when old Esperanza spoke. I had not seen her come. A small ancient woman, brown and folded as a walnut, leaning on a stick, who had walked in from the wash on her own legs because nobody in this town would send for her, but somebody had told her, in the night, and she had come anyway, the way the flour-dusted woman said she would. And then we'd have to listen. She did not shout. She had the kind of voice that makes a crowd go quiet to hear it, the voice of someone very old who has stopped being afraid. "You want to know what the girl says?" Esperanza said in English into the silence. "I speak her tongue. I will tell you what she says, and you will every one of you stand here and hear it because you have been very careful not to ask." She turned to the girl, spoke softly in Apache. The girl answered haltingly, then faster, the whole thing pouring out of her, a year of it, and the old woman listened with her eyes closed, and then she opened them and she told the town of Cabezon what its silence had bought. I will not write here all of what the girl said. Some of it is hers, not mine to set down. But I will tell you that by the end of it there were women in that crowd weeping into their aprons and men who could not lift their eyes from the dirt. And the truth of what Caleb Prout had kept in that barn for a year stood naked in the morning light where every one of them had to look at it. The truth of what they had all known, a little, and chosen not to know. The truth that the woman on the wagon had not murdered an innocent boy. She had come for her stolen child, and a monster had died in a fire, and the only crime anyone could honestly hang her for was being the mother who came. She did not set the fire, Esperanza said. The girl set it to free herself, while he slept. A long pause. Hang the child then if you are hanging the guilty. Go on, walk the horse. Hang the 12-year-old who burned the man who used her in front of her mother, and then you may all go home and have your breakfast and call it law. Nobody moved. I have seen shame settle on a crowd. It is a slow and ugly thing, and there is no satisfaction in it, whatever you might hope. It is just a lot of frightened people realizing, all at once, what they are and having nowhere to put it. They cut her down. The sheriff did it himself in the end with everyone watching, because there was nothing else he could do that would let him keep his crooked star, and he was the kind of man who would always choose the thing that let him keep it. He climbed up on the wagon and took the noose off her neck and cut the rope from her hands, and he did not meet her eyes while he did it, and she watched him the whole time with that cold, counting gaze, memorizing him, the way she'd memorized all of them. The oldest Prout rode out that morning and did not come back, and within a year the Prout land was sold and the family scattered, and Cabzon told itself a story in which it had done the right thing all along. Towns are very good at that. It is how they go on living with themselves. Naish and her daughter did not stay to hear the story Cabzon told. I took them south. That part of her wish I kept exactly. 3 days' ride to the river crossing, to the Mexican families who knew her people and asked no questions. And we went slow because Naish's legs were a long time healing, and the girl needed feeding up, and Dewey was carrying 3 when he was built for 1, and complained about it the entire way, which I told him was fair. On the second night, by a small fire I finally let us build, the girl slept and Naish sat across from me, and we talked, her English better than she'd let on, mine improving with her patience. I asked her, finally, the thing I'd wondered since the rocks, why she'd told me the truth that first night when I was a stranger, when a lie would have been safer. She looked at me a long while across the fire. "Because you took off your hat," she said. I waited. "In the street, when you spoke to me before, when you thought I could not understand, you took off your hat." She turned a stick in the fire. "A man does not take off his hat for a thing, only for a person. I had been a thing for 3 days, you took off your hat." She shrugged, as if it were obvious, as if it explained the whole of human decency, which perhaps it does. "So I decided to spend my last words on you. I thought, this one might keep a promise, even if I am dead." "I didn't keep the promise," I said. "You told me to forget you, to take her south and leave you. I didn't do that. I gambled her life to come back for you, if it had gone wrong." "It did not go wrong." "But it could have. I had no right, you told me." "I told you to save my daughter," Naish said, and her eyes in the firelight were her daughter's eyes, fierce and level. "You saved my daughter. You also saved her mother. I find I am not angry about the second thing." And there it was again, the thing I'd seen in the dark when she'd laughed at my poor joke about my name, the faintest flicker at the corner of her mouth. "You are a very bad listener, Tom Ashby. It is, I think, your best quality." I parted from them at the river crossing. I had thought I might stay. I had let myself imagine it a little on the ride south, an old man with no kin finding a kind of kin, a place at someone's fire, the girl growing up where I could watch. But that is a story I'd have been telling myself, and I had had enough by then of the stories people tell themselves. They had their own people across that river. They had a life to rebuild that had no shape in it for a gray cowhand who didn't speak their tongue, and would only ever be the reminder of the worst week of their lives. Sometimes the kindest thing love does is know when it isn't needed anymore. So I said my goodbyes at the water. The girl hugged me around the neck the way she had in the rocks, and I felt how much stronger her arms were already. 2 weeks of food and safety putting the child back into the child, and I thanked God for it plainly, out loud, which I do not often do. And Naish stood in front of me and did not hug me, because that was not her way, but she reached out and took my old hat off my head, gentle, and looked at it, and looked at me. And then she put it back, and she pressed it down firm, the way you'd settle a hat on a man you were sending somewhere. "Go ahead," she said, "and see if it is safe." It took me a moment, then I remembered, Naish, the one who goes ahead to see if it is safe. She had given me her own name. The only thing of value she'd had left to give, that night against the tree, and now again, here, at the water, her name, her meaning, pressed into me along with the hat. I could not speak. I am not ashamed to say it. I touched the brim the way you do, and I turned due north, and I rode, and I did not let myself look back until I had crossed the first rise, and when I did look back they were already at the river, 2 small figures, the woman and the girl, wading across toward whatever came next, and the water was bright around them, and they did not look back either, which was right, which was as it should be. I have filled a good many pages of my tally book since then. Weather, miles, the price of oats, the names of men who owe me, the small accountings of an ordinary life. But there are 4 notes I hum sometimes on long rides in the dark when the cold comes up out of the ground. I do not have an ear for music. I never get them quite right. It does not seem to matter. I am an old man now, and I have done very few things in my life that I am sure of. I turned away in Tucson, and I have never forgiven myself, and I never will. But once, in a town called Cabzon, I did not turn away. Once I took off my hat for a tied-up woman the whole world had decided was guilty, and a child walked back into the lion's mouth because her mother was inside it, and an old coward learned that courage is not a thing you have. It is a thing you do, one small terrible chance at a time while you are afraid. The girl would be a grown woman now, with children of her own maybe. I like to think she sings them 4 notes in the dark. I like to think she tells them her mother was not afraid.